Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello listeners, you're with me, Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, and we're on Big Little Small Talk. Today in Big Little Small Talk, I've got a very special guest and her name is Aunty Barb or Barbara Walker Menz. Yes, thank you, Barb, for being my guest today.
No worries at all.
Now, Barb, we saw each other a couple of days ago at a very special event here in Pittsworth, and it was called The Big Cheese. Now, I had a business in Pittsworth for 11 years, and I did not know the story of the Big Cheese. Can you tell me about what's it mean?
Well, I've only lived in Pittsworth for just over 3.5 years. But I've been a volunteer up at the Pioneer Village since about July, August of 2020. And every time I walked into the hall there called Yarranlee Soldiers Memorial Hall, there's this replica of this giant cheese. And it's intrigued me since I started working as a volunteer. And then I realised that this year was its 100th anniversary. So it was actually formed here in Pittsworth at the Pittsworth Cheese Factory in September, October of 1923. And it was then railed to Brisbane and then shipped from Brisbane to Wembley in England to go to the Empire exhibition, where it won first prize in the cheddar cheese making section. And at that stage, because its dimensions were 5.5 feet across and 2.5 feet tall, and it weighed 1.5 tonne. It became known as the world's biggest cheese. To actually get to that stage in 1923, we were in the middle of a drought, and the milk suppliers to the Pittsworth Cheese Factory couldn't actually supply all the milk that was needed. So the Pittsworth factory called in the milk and the curd from the branch factories out from the outlying areas, and they actually managed to make this huge cheese.
So let's get it into perspective. 1.5 tonnes is 1,500 kilograms, is that correct?
I think it's 3,366 kilos.
It's a lot anyway.
It is a lot.
So did they set out to make the best cheese or the biggest cheese?
I think it was a bit of both.
Right.
Apparently in 1921, Southbrook Cheese Factory actually made a 1/2 tonne cheese, which they entered into the Brisbane exhibition, which is now known as the Ekka. And it won second prize for its cheese making. And the story through the newspapers and sort of local gossip, so to speak, is that the people of Pittsworth decided that they would outdo Southbrook with their cheese making. But the Pittsworth factory was actually approached by the Australian dairy representatives for the Empire exhibition and asked whether they would be able to make a big cheese, which is how it all came about. And they actually had to form a special mould for the cheese. And then when it was all finished, they then had to make a special crate to get it onto the train, to get it to Brisbane, and then obviously over to England.
So, what you said, the Empire, what was it?
The Empire exhibition.
Tell me about that. What does that mean?
It was a big, almost like an expo that was held for quite a few years in England, and it was all the countries in the British Empire could actually submit items to the exhibition. So I believe some areas were actually, like the cheese factory, were actually approached to see whether there was something that they could do to enter into the exhibition. But yeah, it went for quite a few years.
Right. And what happened to the big cheese in the end? Did they throw it away? Did they feed it to the cows?
No. It was actually, the big cheese itself was bought by a company called Home and Country in England, And after the exhibition was over and all the judging and everything was done, they actually sold off chunks of cheese to the people in England. And then some people were really lucky to actually find an Australian shilling piece in their cheese. And back then the metals that was used in the cheese didn't actually taint the food, like our old Christmas puddings when we used to have sixpences and threepences and stuff in it. You wouldn't do that with today's coins, but back then it was done. Yeah, so apparently there was £5 worth of shilling pieces put into the cheese.
And why do you think they did that? Like, was that just a novelty thing, or did they know
No,
it
it's
was
actually
going to be...
the story that I've been reading and researching is that a couple of years beforehand there were reports coming back to Australia that some companies overseas were actually taking the Australian wrappers off the cheese and putting their own wrappers on the cheese. So they decided to do a little experiment, and in some of the blocks of cheese they'd actually put shillings beforehand. And then they were getting reports back from people overseas saying, I bought this French cheese, but I've got an Australian shilling in it.
An amazing story.
So it was sort of like, it was a really big problem for a while, because the cheese quality between Australia and New Zealand was so good. It was outdoing some of the cheese makers in Europe. So they were taking our wrappers off and putting their wrappers on and selling it as their cheese.
Isn't that amazing? Tell me about dairying and cheese making and butter making here in Pittsworth. And what I'm going to get at is, you had at the function the other day, you had some descendants of the head cheesemaker.
We did, yes. Percy Stockbridge Farrington was the cheesemaker that was responsible for making the big cheese in 1923. And in the Pittsworth area, there were actually 9, I'm going to say main cheese and butter factories. And they were at places like Mount Tyson, Linthorpe, Scrubby Mountain, Springside, Irongate, Pittsworth, Southbrook, just to name a few of them. But throughout the whole of the Darling Downs, there was something like 78 cheese, butter and condensed milk factories. And actually one of those condensed milk factories was at Wairema, which I've been asked to do see if I can do some research on, but I haven't started that yet. I've got other things on my mind at the minute. So I think the whole dairying industry, there were so many dairy farms around, and quite a lot of the original business for the Pittsworth area that I found through the research and talking to some of the old dairy farmers, is it was purely, they would do their own milk and cream at the farm, and then when there was a factory that was needing cream for butter or whatever, then they would actually sell their produce to them, which is still happening today. Unfortunately, the cheese factory here at Pittsworth closed in 1980, and I believe the Southbrook one closed between 1984 and 1986. But quite a few people that I've talked to say they remember actually either coming to the Pittsworth cheese factory or the Southbrook one just to get the cheese, and it was almost the weekend trip for the family to come into the cheese factory and get their supply and take it home again. And one lady told me that on one of their trips, by the time they got home, they had no cheese left because everybody was nibbling it in the car. So, it was a big achievement, a really big industry.
Yeah, a very similar story. We lived in Tara, and my mother, after school, on special days, we would go into the co-op and she'd get a slice of Pittsworth mild, and that was that was our treat. There wasn't that much of that left by the time we got home either. So you started to say before the descendants of the cheesemaker, Mr. Farrington.
Yes.
And you had some other people at the function who were descendants of, I suppose, 1980s, really recent history, isn't it?
It is. We actually were lucky enough to have Percy Farrington's granddaughter, who is the daughter of his youngest child, Colin. She actually travelled up from Brisbane just for the event to come in and be there, which was wonderful. We also had great nieces. So this is Percy's sister's grandchildren. They were there too. So we had two great grandnieces and one great grandson or nephew, sorry. And it was really lovely to be able to have them included in the day, because it was sort of like there's still Farringtons and the extended family within the area. And the fact that Percy did make this big cheese, and then he also went on the next year to make a bigger cheese, which was about 300 kilos heavier than the one that won first prize. But I haven't been able to find anything other than this big cheese was actually shipped to Brisbane in 1925, March of 1925, for the Empire exhibition in 1925. And that's all I've been able to find, is that it was made and it was slightly bigger than the last one, but there's nothing to say whether it won anything, whether it actually reached England. I just can't seem to find out. So
isn't that a fascinating story? I know you mentioned before about the hall that's up at the Pioneer Village, and it's a hall that has come from Yarranlee.
Yarranlee,
and
yes.
It's a beautiful wooden hall that's not been painted, and it's got all of this dairying memorabilia. What's that big machine with the wax? Tell me about that. What's that?
Well, yes, the waxing machine. Before I was learned as into what all the equipment was, I actually thought that was a pasteuriser because of the big heating pipes that go around it, and not being knowledgeable in the cheese industry. I sort of, when I was asked, I thought, oh, maybe with those tubes it's a pasteuriser, but I've since found out that it's a waxer. So they would actually have the wax in there, and then they were heating coils to actually melt the wax. And then above it, there's a cradle that they would place the cheeses on and then lower it into the wax. And then when they pulled it out and the cheese dried a little bit, they'd turn the cheese from where it was resting on the cradle and then paint the wax onto those marks so that the whole cheese was then encased in wax. So there's so many different pieces of equipment in the hall. Originally, when the hall came to the Pioneer Village, the side room, which is now the medical room, was actually set up with the return services memorabilia. And it was there for quite a few years before the RSL actually built the bigger building just off to the side from it. So when all that memorabilia was moved out of that room, they then changed the display and put all the medical stuff in there. But all the cheese making equipment that is in the hall comes from places like Mount Tyson, Southbrook, Pittsworth, Felton. There's quite a few dairies and cheese factories that have actually contributed to the display and the memorial to the local cheese and dairy industry.
I know when we were walking around there the other day, there were all the pats and all the different things, and people... and the machine that wrapped it in the paper and put the label on it, and you've got all the labels there from Pittsworth cheese, and then it became Unity, or Unity was a competition?
I think Unity was the name that the Darling Downs Dairy Company went under when it was formed in Toowoomba, and it had quite a few of the smaller dairies that couldn't actually supply milk or curd to Pittsworth would then send it into Toowoomba. But I think the Unity brand was because the original brand for Pittsworth was actually called Golden Wattle. But I haven't actually found any wrappers for Golden Wattle. I think it might be a little bit too far away. And we've also got cheese there from the blocks from Mount Tyson and Southbrook and a couple of other little cheese making places around. So it's a really good display.
It is great, and I just love that you took it on and gave it its prominence, because these things do get forgotten, and to see that replica big cheese, it's like just an enormous chopping block or something, isn't it?
It's massive, and the thing that really got me was that every time I entered Yarranlee Hall, this giant yellow replica was standing there. And it wasn't until the beginning of the year that I realised it had 1923 on it, and I'm thinking, that's 100 years ago. And then I did some reading of the posters and things that are on the side of the cheese, and realised that it was October that it was actually shipped to Brisbane. And I thought, we've got to do something. We've got to recognise all the dairying families from around the area that contributed milk to that product that was an award winner and was known to be the world's biggest cheese for 44 years before it was outdone by a state in America.
Right. Well, we won't talk too much about that. I'll just remind the listeners that you are with me, Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, and we're in Big Little Small Talk, and we're talking to Barb Walker Menz, who has created her own little bit of fame here. And every time she says the big cheese, I don't know what it is, whether it's something to do with the big kahuna or something like that. I have a laugh. But Barb, I want to sort of go away from the cheese. You said you've only been in Pittsworth for 3 years. Where did you come from?
We actually were travelling for 7 years in our caravan all over Australia after we left our house in Victoria Point in Brisbane. And then our daughter and grandchildren moved to Toowoomba. And we would be coming and going, and then we would be doing farm sits and things for friends in the area, and we would keep coming back. And then, unfortunately, I got quite ill in 2019, and when I came out of hospital, because of my illness, I wasn't able to lie flat, so I couldn't actually sit up in the caravan to sleep. And our daughter sort of said, well, no, you're not going back to the caravan, you'll stay with us. But I felt really bad because I had to kick one of my grandchildren out of their beds, and I said to my husband, that's it, I want my own house again. I'd like to have, if anything were to happen again, I'd have my own bed to come home to. And we started looking around. We looked into all around Toowoomba and Esk and Crow's Nest and Oakey, Dolby, the whole area. And one day we came across this little open house, and we came and had a look, and then we came back and had a second look, and the rest is history now. It's we've been here since April 2020 and absolutely love the community. It's just brilliant.
So when you lived in Victoria, was it Victoria Point?
Victoria Point.
Were you the type of person who got really involved in the community there as well? Are you a serial community giver?
Well, no, not really, because I was still working at that stage.
Mm-hmm. What type of work were you doing? I
was a nurse unit manager for midwifery, and that was sort of like a full-on job. I had a staff of 64 midwives. And also the sort of like the enrolled nurses and the nurses' aides and all the staff on the ward, which I absolutely loved. But because of my illness, Queensland Health decided that I was better off retired rather than possibly being unsteady at work and not being able to cope.
And how did you feel about that? Was that kind of a sudden retirement?
It was actually. It was out of my hands, completely not my decision, and it took probably almost 18 months, 2 years to get used to the fact that I wasn't going back to work and I wasn't going to see my staff on a daily basis, and it was hard. But then we upgraded from a camper trailer to a caravan and really said, okay, you're not going back to work. How about we travel Australia? So that's what we did.
And favourite sort of memories of that time?
Oh, look, there are so many beautiful, interesting places right around the country. I honestly don't think I could pinpoint one place that didn't interest us. There was just something happening, and the changing countryside as you're driving around and the people you meet as you're going around. We actually met one couple who had been travelling Queensland for 5 years and hadn't left the state, and they just said, when we've been here a few days and we're leaving, we get in the caravan, toss the coin and say left or right, and then we might go back to somewhere we've been, we might go on to somewhere we haven't. But the thing that I found was that when we were travelling, we would travel so far and we'd stop for morning tea, and if we were in a town, we would actually go and buy a tea or a coffee, and then we would talk to the locals as we were walking around. Is there anything to see? What do you recommend? All that sort of stuff. And so we got to see quite a lot of the country and a lot of really interesting places that most people wouldn't see, because a lot of people are in too much of a rush to get from point A to point B, whereas we would just dawdle along and we would stop every couple of hours and make the best of it.
Barb, you're obviously a real people person, and you can see that. Everyone who's met you knows that. Tell me about your upbringing. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Wagga Wagga, well, in the district of Wagga Wagga in New South Wales. I was actually born in Wagga Wagga, but the first couple of years of my life I lived out near Urana, and then after that I moved to a property on the Narandra Road, and then after that my dad and mum were leasing a small property at a little village called Mara, which was a very tiny little village. And then,
what were they doing? What sort of work were they doing?
My dad was virtually a jack of all trades. He was a butcher by trade, but he got more enjoyment out of farm work, and he would build fences, and some of those fences that he built are still standing today, which is amazing. And Mum was the stay-at-home mum, because by the time we moved to Mara, there were 6 children in the family. And Mum had her hands full with us 6 children, and Dad would be off doing farm work, but he'd come home most evenings. And then our holidays were actually in at our grandparents in Wagga, or staying with our cousins in Wagga. And then I went to school. Primary school was in Mara and high school was in Wagga.
And where did you fit into that family of 6?
I was the eldest daughter, but the second child.
Mm-hmm. And were your mum and dad, were they quite compatible? Do you remember?
Unfortunately, no. They, not long after we moved to Mara, they separated and divorced. So Mum was a single mum with 6 children, living on a little 7-acre farm, probably about 1.5 miles out of town. But we had a good, loving family with Mum, and we always had cats and dogs and sheep and cows and ducks and geese and all that sort of thing. And sometimes it was really hard for Mum being able to afford things, so we had a lot of hand-me-downs and stuff like that from our cousins. But when we were growing up, it wasn't a really big, oh my God, it's not a label. We were just glad to have, sort of clothes that we could wear. And if we didn't have shoes on our feet, which was most of the time, we were either running around barefoot or we had thongs on our feet or something like that. But we just grew up knowing that, we could get things when Mum could afford it. Or we made it ourselves.
How did she survive, your mother?
She actually had a home garden, so like a veggie patch, and she had a big sign out the front, and she would, as the seasons changed, she would paint the sign black and then paint in white what was available, and she would actually sell the produce from the house. Or other than that, she would do knitting. She would get requests to knit a couple of school jumpers or crochet blankets or everything like that. Probably up until I was, she did it right up until she went into the nursing home with her Alzheimer's actually. But she just did.
And were you, as kids then, able to sort of look after her as you got older and were working and things?
More so my younger brothers and sisters. My older brother became an electrician and he was moving around the district. I started my nurse training in Sydney and then came back to Wagga once I completed my training. My 2 sisters have lived in and around Wagga all their life. So's my youngest brother, Ian. My other brother lives up in the Blue Mountains, and he and his family have got multiple pies that they deal with up there. I'm mainly, my older brother at the moment's just moved to Western Australia, and I'm the one that sort of moved around because I actually married a serviceman. So we were moved around, not as often as some of our friends were, but we did move around the country.
How did you meet your husband?
10-pin bowling in Wagga.
Very above board, yes. None of this hinge or anything like that these days.
Yeah, no, we were starting off the new year of bowling, and Daryl was put into the team that I was in with my cousins, and it was took a little while, but it was after that. So,
Barb, you have a side hustle, a pretty big side hustle, and it's called Barb's Weaving.
It is, yes.
Because you are a renowned artist with your weaving. Can you tell me how you learnt to weave, why you learnt to weave, and the joy that you get from weaving?
I get immense joy from weaving. I actually can remember weaving, I'll put that loosely, with my sisters out in the front lawn with the daisies, making daisy chains and making string out of the grass and stuff like that. It was just something that we did, It was it kept us occupied and kept us out of mum's hair, and we weren't sort of doing anything we shouldn't have been doing. But it all sort of went into abeyance until probably about 13 years ago. And prior to that, I just worked with any sort of craft. If it was knitting or crochet or cross-stitch or paper craft or anything like that, anything to do with craft, I would try. And if I liked it, I would keep doing it. But I started, when we were travelling in the caravan, I used to cut out all my patchwork and quilting. And I would have it all pre-cut and lined and all that sort of stuff, so that as we were travelling around, when Daryl was fishing, I could sit at the caravan and do my sewing with the sewing machine. But it became a real weight issue in the caravan because it was heavy in its unmade state, heavy and bulky in its made state. So trying to find somewhere to put it after I'd finished it became a real challenge. And then Daryl and I discussed it, and we sort of thought, because I was dabbling in weaving again, we decided that we would do the weaving because all my products are lightweight in their unmade state. And then when they're made, they're still light, but you can shove things inside other things. And it's amazing what you can fit in my little cupboard in the caravan.
So it was a pragmatic decision that we went into the weaving.
It was, but it's actually reconnected me with my ancestral family. And it's reconnected me with the country. Being a Wiradjuri person, we didn't really talk about it when we were growing up, and my dad sort of said it was for the fear that, he used to call me the loudspeaker. I'd be the one that would go and say, I'm Aboriginal and all that sort of stuff. And in the early 60s, they were still coming and taking children just because. And he said, he sort of told me that we were a throwback to the Black Germans, because if we had German heritage, then they couldn't come and take us away because there was nothing to sort of give them any inclination. So it wasn't until I was much older that Dad sort of said, well, no, you're not. You are Aboriginal and your family come from here. And it answered a lot of questions, but it also made an awful lot more. And I suppose I've spent most of the last, I would say 35 years, trying to find all the story behind it. Because about the only uncle that I've got remaining that is willing to talk about it is almost 95. And he acknowledges and he clarifies some things for me. But then there's other family members that just say, stop trying to dig up skeletons and, don't dig up the past. But it's connected to me. And whenever we drive home, actually, going down to Wagga, it doesn't matter which way we go, but whenever we get onto Wiradjuri land, it's as though I've just got this calming feeling. And it's not in the same spot each time we go down, but it's there. And it's sort of like, and Daryl gets to the point now where he just says, yes, I know, you're on Wiradjuri country. So it just connects me.
So tell me a little bit about that history. This is through your father's side of the family, isn't it?
It's through my father's mother. Mm-hmm. Her father. We haven't got definite proof of where he was born, because his baptismal certificate says that he was born 3 months after his older brother. So he came into the family in 1857, and everything that we can find, we don't know where his family which part of country he originated from. But everything that he did, everything that he managed, he was a well-renowned carpenter, very, very well respected, very well honoured. And he and his wife Jane, a Scottish lady, went on to have 13 children. My grandmother was one of the last. She was born in 1898. And the history of tracing back and trying to get family to recollect things that have happened takes time, and sometimes it's persistence, not letting it go, and getting people to openly talk about what it was like growing up. My uncle, who's almost 95, he can remember his grandfather, and he just said, he was just a wonderful man.
Do you have any photographs of him?
I do, on the wall. Yeah. It's this beautiful photo of, it's been in quite a few publications. One of them was by Sherry Norris in Wagga, and the chapter was called To Wait and Weep. And it's actually a photo of the day that great uncle Alan came home from war, World War One. He was greeted at the train station in Wagga by the mayor and the councillors and everybody, he and another young soldier. And then there's this beautiful photo that was taken outside my great-grandparents' home in Wagga, and it's got all the family and the neighbours and everybody there to welcome great uncle Alan and the other soldier home. And we came across, I'd seen the photo in the publication, but in 2015 we were down in Wagga and we walked into the museum, and here on this wall, the whole wall was taken up by this photograph, and I was just standing there awestruck. And the young lady behind the counter said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "That's my family. It's my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, my grandmother's up there."
I suppose what I am interested in, I mean, obviously you're very proud of him, but that your father even had, so that was his grandfather, wasn't it? That he had this fear of being discriminated against, but if you said that you're Aboriginal.
I think discrimination could be the word, because back then Aboriginal people weren't allowed to freely move around the country. They couldn't just freely go and do work wherever, and they weren't allowed to own property. And because my great-grandfather, he could move all around the state because he was the foreman for the building company, and he owned property, and then my grandmother was also a property owner, and then mum and dad owned property. I think it was the general, I suppose it was a fear that at any minute it could all be taken away from them, and us children could have been taken away. Mum and dad could have lost their house. Dad could have lost his job because he wasn't able to move around the country or around the Shire. I think it was just this really big fear. And then when the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were actually given the vote in 1967, that changed things. A lot of that fear did tend to go, I'm not going to say it went away, but it was reduced greatly. So I think that's why Dad then felt that once I was actually a teenager, he could actually openly talk about it.
And do you think he was proud of his Indigenous heritage? Or was he just the type of guy?
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. It was not something that he talked about.
So, historically, we've just had a second referendum which has been lost. How did you feel with the result, Barb? Can you talk about it?
I felt disappointed because I thought I thought the majority of the Australian people recognised that we need to change the Constitution to recognise that there were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here. It wasn't terra nullius, it was actually occupied land. And just to give people to say, yes, we do recognise that. So if we can get this recognised and the Constitution changed, then we can start talking about treaties and reconciliation and everything. So I was really disappointed, but we're not giving up. We will keep working at it, and we will work towards a treaty of some description. But the thing is that it won't just be one treaty for one group, I don't think, because each different mob would need their own separate treaty, I feel. I could be very wrong, but I think they need to go from each mob to each mob and talk to them about what they need.
Did you feel like there was all these people being able to have a say in your future and you were sort of quite powerless in a way?
In a way, yes, because I found the other thing that I wasn't sure whether we would get the referendum was because nobody could tell us how it was going to be done or who the voice was going to be. And I think everybody was looking to the government and to the people behind the Yes campaign to tell us how that was going to happen, and it never ever came out. It never was said, okay, so if we get the yes vote, then this is how it will all come into play.
Well, I could argue about that, Barb, because I think my understanding is that the government was there to legislate it, but how it was going to be formulated and who those people were going to come from the Indigenous community themselves. But anyway, yeah, I think that might just make my blood start to boil a little bit, because I can clearly see which way I voted.
Yeah.
Tell me about the weaving. Let's go back to the weaving. Where do you get your materials from? I know you're really interested. You use grasses and things.
I do.
What's the process?
I use. I tend to use as much natural grass as I can. If I can't get natural grass, then I use the natural palm leaf called raffia, which is readily available for weaving. But the kumbungi or bulrush is the grass that I use. There's a couple of nice little creeks and dams around that have got a ready supply of them. And then I have to harvest them, and then I hang them in the garage for anything up to 6 or 7 months for it to actually dry out. And then before I use it, I've actually got to wet it and give it some flexibility again before I can split it or fold it or do anything like that with it. I also use lamandra, which is grown just about everywhere. Just about every car park in the area has got lamandra growing. I've just got to get there before the gardeners come along and chop the heads off them. I use some of the grasses around, some of the sedges, I use those. I can also use agapanthus, red hot poker leaves, dianella leaves, anything that's got a bit of strength to it. I can use that either as a core fibre or as a stitcher. If I don't have those, then I use just about anything. I can wrap nylon cord and use that as my centre core that I'm weaving over. I can weave with wool, cotton, twine, anything like that.
What sort of things are you making? I noticed you're wearing that's a
sister basket.
Sister basket, thank you. And you put a coin in there, don't you?
Well, I've actually got crystals in mine that have all got centering properties, so they hopefully keep me fairly upright, so that my Meniere's doesn't kick in and I don't keel over. And then I just recharge them every month in the full moon. So I tip the crystals out and I recharge them, and every now and then I'll actually earth them, so I actually put them into the ground and recharge them that way. But my weaving...
much more spiritual than a coin barb. And then, are you getting better with your weaving?
I think so. I'm trying different techniques and different fibres and trying different things, but I find that I always go back to my traditional coiling weave.
That's the style.
It's the style. Yeah, it's the coil of the weave.
So and you make baskets.
I make baskets and trays, earrings, necklaces. I have been, this last year I've been, I'm going to call it playing with gourds. So gourds are pumpkins, marrow, squashes and things that have actually been allowed to dry in the field. So when I get them, if you shake them, it sounds like a maraca. But I get all different shapes and sizes, and I get them and I bring them home and I sit them on the table and I let them sit there so that I can work out how I want to cut them and how I want to weave with them. And then I give them a good sand down, and then I give them a wash, and then I actually coat them with varnish, clear varnish, and then I coat the inside with beeswax, and then I weave. And it really depends on the size and the shape of the gourd as to the type of weave that I do and the shape of it.
So are you weaving around the top, or are you weaving a case for it?
No, I actually cut off at a certain point, and then hubby drills holes in it so that I can actually weave through the holes, and then I weave up or out. It really depends on the shape of the gourd at the bottom as to what I do.
So I see, I don't know why it comes up on my Instagram feed, but I get a lot of weaving videos coming up of some of those incredible weavers up in the Northern Territory and things. Have you taken any classes from master weavers? Or?
I actually spent a week with Aunty Bronwyn Razem down in Geelong a couple of years ago. She's a Gunjamara woman, and she was just lovely. We went out and we gathered some kumbungi, and we gathered flax out of the garden out in front of her unit, and we just wove all week and had yarns and talked about different fibres and different ways of colouring it and all that sort of stuff. I have done a couple of workshops with Renee Barlu up on the Sunshine Coast, and she hasn't done of recent years, but she used to bring the lady, she called her Yabuk, from Gumbalanya in the Northern Territory. She used to bring Aunty Patricia and Aunty Catherine, Aunty Patricia and Aunty Kathleen down from Gumbalanya, and they would come down for a week and they would just weave all week. She would have workshops every day, and they would show how to actually, with the pandanus fibre from the Northern Territory, how you actually stripped it and then you would split it and get the fibre that you could work with. And because the pandanus fibre is curved, the convex side of it, the outer edge of it, is the bit that you would actually weave with, whereas the concave side would be your filler, would be your core. So that would be the fibre that you would actually be weaving over. And that was really interesting. And then also dyeing with the different leaves and bark and roots and all, which was really interesting.
Yeah, very much so. And are you taking classes now too? You're giving classes?
I'm teaching classes, yes. I actually have... I'm trying to... thankfully with Cafe de Velo in Toowoomba, they've actually been letting me use part of their space to do a 4-hour workshop every month or so. And that's been really good. We've had some incidences there. Well, we had one where we had 5 people there, which was brilliant. The last couple, we've only had 1 or 2 come due to people having to pull out at the last minute because of health issues. But it's been really good because we've been able to do different types of weaving. So not just the coiling weave, we've also done the twining or the twisting weave and string making.
And if you wanted to do a weaving class, how do I find you?
I actually advertise it on my Facebook page. And
you are?
I am Barb's Weaving on Facebook. It just comes up as Barb's Weaving Site. And I advertise on there when I'm doing a class. I put it up as an event.
Barb, you've got a lot of irons in the fire, haven't you? So what's next?
Next year, my husband tells me I've got to slow down a little bit. So I've actually putting aside definite times next year where I won't be doing workshops or travel. But I do like going out. I go out to Tara a couple of times a year. And do weaving with the community out there. I was supposed to go next week, but we've actually postponed that until the end of November because of the current fire situation, until the town can sort of work out what they're doing, where they're going. But I'm looking forward to that because I actually think it will actually give the people of the town something else to think of rather than everything that's happening. But I get a joy out of doing that, and I get a joy out of doing my teaching with the schools as well. I've got a couple of schools that I go to where I do weaving 1 hour a week with the students. And it's a time where even the students say, this is really good, I'm really enjoying this. So they get little tasks that they've got to complete. And then once they've done a couple of little set items, then it's what do you want to make now? Do you want to make a bowl? Would you like to make some earrings? Would you like to make a pendant? Would you like to make a tray?
And you think it's such a good craft because it's not seen as either male or female.
No, it's not.
And then the things of the conversation while your hands are busy would be very interesting.
It is actually, because I was doing some professional development days with the education department in Hume Street, and a lot of the participants would come in, and it was only a 2-hour session, but a lot of the participants would go, I don't know whether I can stay all the time because, they were thinking about what they were doing. And then suddenly it was sort of like, oh my goodness, that 2 hours went fast and I'm still here.
That's right. A bit like playing with Lego, I suppose. Your brain goes somewhere else.
You do. Yeah. You actually get involved in what you're doing and everything else. And to me, it's a way of clarifying what's happening, and it brings everything into perspective. And it's amazing how in tune my husband and I are after 45 years of marriage. I'll be thinking, wonder what would happen if I tried this, and then the next minute the little voice would pop up and go, have you ever thought about?
Wow, I love this story. Yeah.
So we tend to think along similar lines, and I try different things. If I'm not really happy with it, then I will go. I just completely come back to my coiling weave because I get a lot of joy out of making something that I either give as a gift or I have at the markets, or and just sharing the joy of weaving, teaching it and passing it on to the up-and-coming generation.
And also that connection to your history that you mentioned earlier.
And connection to country, connection to culture. Connection to people.
Yeah. Well, Barb, you talk about that time going quickly. That's happened to us as well. My 2 questions I like to ask at the end of every interview. Are you a royal? Do you have a favourite royal?
Do I have a favourite royal? I think the one I used to love, Princess Diana. But I think my most favourite royal is actually Crown Princess Mary of Denmark. She was virtually just a girl from nowhere who has gone on to, she found the love of her life at a pub in Sydney. And she's gone on to have those beautiful children, and she and Frederick are doing okay over in Denmark. So that's, I think she's my favourite.
She sounds like she found her own special Daryl, do you think?
I think so.
What about the song that can't keep you off the dance floor?
Well, my husband reckons that's Nutbush City Limits, but I actually reckon that's YMCA.
Either one of those.
Either one.
A bit of choreography.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That I don't do very well.
But you like to participate.
I do like to participate. Yeah. I've got to be careful though, because if it gets too rowdy, then I lose my balance and then I just fall into people. So it's sort of no strobe lights or anything like that.
To topple over. Well, Barb, our time's got away, but it's just been a joy having you tell me your story. And you started off with the big cheese this afternoon, but we got to, I think, something much more not closer to your heart, but it shows me the depth and strength of where you are and where you've come from.
I really do. I find that my weaving does ground me, and it really does reconnect me with my family and my country and other artists as well. And other people, just sharing the joy with other people. It's great.
Well, that's been lovely. So thank you, Aunty Barb Walker Menz from Barb's Weaving, and lots of other things too, including the big cheese. So thank you very much, Aunty Barb, for being my guest on Big Little Small Talk.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.